The base armory was never meant to be loud. It hummed instead, soft, mechanical, alive with the quiet rhythm of work. Metal tapped against metal. Springs clicked. Bolts slid into place. The air smelled like oil and cold steel, sharp enough to sting the nose. She worked alone at the far bench, shoulders slightly hunched, hair pulled tight, eyes fixed on a stripped rifle. Soldiers passed behind her without slowing. Contractors spoke over her, not to her. Someone nearby laughed about weekend plans, then glanced her way and smirked, as if she were part of the furniture. "Hey," one of them muttered, not unkind, not kind either. "That one even know what she's doing?" Before she could respond, Boots stopped behind her. A ranger captain stood there still, unreadable, watching her hands move. "Is a confirmed sniper shot at 3,820 meters physically possible?" he asked. Someone snorted. Another whispered, "That's a joke, right?" She didn't look up. Her voice was calm, precise. "Possible doesn't mean repeatable," she said. "Wind drift, density altitude, spin drift, Coriolis. Every variable compounds. You don't beat physics. You negotiate with it." The laughter faded. Tools stopped moving. And for the first time, the room listened. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to FOB Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Her name was Ivy Calder, and she was 28 years old. On paper, she was listed as a civilian weapons systems technician, contracted to maintain and calibrate small arms and long-range platforms on base. In real life, she was the woman most people forgot the moment they turned away. She preferred it that way. Ivy had built her entire routine around not being seen, not being remembered, and never being asked questions she didn't want to answer. She arrived before sunrise every morning, when the armory lights still buzzed to life and the corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold concrete. Her coffee was always black. Her hair was always tied back tight. Her sleeves were always rolled to the same point on her forearms. By the time the first group of soldiers came through, she had already stripped, cleaned, and rebuilt 3 weapons with the same quiet precision most people reserved for prayer. She did not talk much. Not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. Ivy had learned early that silence kept people from asking where she was from, what she used to do, or why her hands were steadier than most. When someone tried to pull her into conversation, she nodded, smiled politely, and went back to work. Headphones in. World out. She fixed weapons, not people. At lunch, she ate alone on the concrete steps behind the maintenance wing. Always the same spot. Always the same angle of sun. She brought her own food, never joined anyone in the cafeteria, and never lingered. She had heard the comments when she thought no one was listening. "She's probably fresh out of school. Must be someone's niece. Looks like an intern." None of them were said with cruelty. That almost made them worse. Once, a visiting contractor leaned over her bench and asked if her supervisor was around. She said she was the supervisor for that station. He laughed, glanced behind her, and repeated the question. She didn't correct him again. She simply handed him the calibration sheet and went back to adjusting the optic mount he had already misaligned. Another time, 2 junior soldiers argued loudly over a rifle issue right next to her. When she quietly offered a correction, one of them waved a hand. "It's fine, we've got it." 10 minutes later, a sergeant walked in, glanced at the weapon, and asked who had touched it last. When Ivy explained what was wrong, he nodded, thanked her, and told the soldiers to redo everything. They never apologized. They just avoided her after that. She worked late, long after the armory officially closed. It wasn't required. It was comfort. The quiet hours were when her breathing slowed, when the noise in her head faded, and when her hands remembered what they were good at. She cleaned tools no one had used in months. She recalibrated scopes that were already within tolerance. She rewrote maintenance logs so neatly they looked printed. No one ever asked why she was so careful. No one ever wondered why she always double-checked windage systems or why she kept personal notebooks filled with calculations no one had assigned her. She never told anyone that she liked knowing exactly how a system behaved when it was pushed past its limits. She never explained that precision calmed her in a way nothing else did. Ivy hated attention. Not because it embarrassed her, but because it made her feel exposed. As a child, she had learned that being noticed meant being questioned. Being questioned meant being remembered, and being remembered meant people eventually wanted more than she could safely give. So she learned to be smaller, quieter, harder to focus on. Once, when she was about 12, she had stood in the backyard holding a broken compass, trying to understand why the needle still shook even when everything around it was still. Her father had crouched beside her and told her that motion didn't always mean chaos. Sometimes it meant sensitivity. Sometimes it meant awareness. She never talked about him now. She never talked about anything that felt like before. There were moments, though, when her habits gave her away. The way she squared her shoulders before lifting heavy equipment. The way her eyes tracked movement automatically. The way she positioned herself near exits without thinking. The way her hands never trembled, even when startled. These were things no one noticed because no one was looking closely enough. And that was exactly how Ivy wanted it. When she walked through the corridors, people stepped around her without slowing. When she spoke, her voice was often talked over. When she asked for signatures or access codes, she was told to check with your supervisor. When she corrected someone, she was thanked politely and forgotten immediately. She carried these moments without resentment. They were familiar, predictable, safe. Invisibility had become her armor. By the time most people learned her name, they had already decided who she was, and Ivy never corrected them. She let them believe she was young, inexperienced, replaceable. It kept her world simple. It kept her from being asked to explain things she could not explain without opening doors she had sealed years ago. So when that ranger captain had stopped behind her bench, when he had asked that question about a 3,820-meter shot, Ivy had answered the way she always did, quietly, precisely, without looking up. She had no idea that this time her invisibility was about to fail, and she wasn't sure yet whether that terrified her or relieved her. The laughter didn't stop right away. It lingered, low and casual, like it belonged there. Someone leaned back against a locker and crossed his arms. Another soldier shook his head, smiling as if the question itself were entertainment. A contractor muttered, "That's not real world, man. That's YouTube stuff." A few people glanced at Ivy, then away again, as if her calm answer had been background noise. 3,820 meters, one of them said. That's almost 4 clicks. Nobody's making that shot. Not with a first-round hit, someone else added. Not outside a lab. They spoke like she wasn't there. Ivy kept working. She adjusted the torque on the scope mount, listening to the click of her tool instead of the voices. She had learned not to respond to disbelief. It fed on reaction. Silence starved it. The ranger captain hadn't laughed. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, eyes on her hands, not her face. When the noise settled, he spoke again. "Walk me through it." A few heads turned. Ivy paused. Then she set her tool down carefully. "At that distance," she said, "you're negotiating with air more than gravity. Wind drift becomes dominant. Density altitude matters more than muzzle velocity. Coriolis effect starts to show up in meaningful ways. Spin drift compounds. And temperature gradients between shooter and target distort everything." Someone scoffed. "You been watching documentaries or something?" She didn't look at him. "Cold bore behavior changes point of impact," she continued. "Barrel harmonics don't repeat perfectly at extreme extension. And your margin of error becomes smaller than the thickness of your reticle." The laughter thinned. A couple of soldiers exchanged looks. The ranger nodded once. "So it's possible." "Possible," Ivy said, "doesn't mean ethical, repeatable, or survivable. It means theoretical. The room went quiet in a way that didn't feel comfortable. One of the soldiers coughed. Another adjusted his vest. A few went back to their business, but slower now. When Ivy returned to her work, she could feel it, a tension brushing against her like static. For the first time in years, someone was actually listening. That should have felt validating. It didn't. It felt dangerous. Over the next few days, the jokes kept coming, but they changed shape. They were quieter. "Hey, science fair," someone said once, half smiling. "Got any formulas for surviving deployment?" Another asked if she could calculate the odds of him getting weekend leave. Someone else called her professor like it was a punchline. Ivy didn't react. She cleaned, logged, recalibrated. But she noticed something else. People were watching now. Not openly, not rudely. Just lingering. And that made her skin itch. The ranger captain came back 2 days later. This time, he didn't stand behind her. He pulled up a stool. That alone made the room feel off. "What platform would you use?" he asked. A couple of soldiers pretended not to listen. Ivy hesitated. "That depends." "On what?" "Stability requirements. Barrel length. Ammunition consistency. Recoil management. Atmospheric predictability." He waited. "Not a lightweight," she added. "You'd need mass. Something that stays honest." "Like a Barrett?" She finally looked up. Their eyes met. He wasn't testing her. He was asking. "A Barrett could work," she said slowly, "if modified correctly." "What modifications?" A few people nearby had stopped what they were doing. She listed them anyway. Optic mounting adjustments. Recoil buffer tuning. Custom bipod geometry. Ammunition selection down to batch numbers. Barrel seasoning protocols. Her voice stayed calm, but her pulse did not. Because no one ever asked her questions like this. Not seriously. Not with that kind of attention. The next day, he came with a tablet. He showed her wind maps. She corrected his assumptions. He showed her terrain modeling. She pointed out an overlooked elevation differential. He asked about spin drift at that range. She answered without hesitation. The room was no longer ignoring her. Smirks had become whispers. Whispers became pauses. Pauses became listening. And Ivy hated it. She hated the way people were starting to stand closer when she spoke. She hated the way some of them looked surprised. She hated the way a few of them looked threatened. What would you have done, she wondered, watching them from the corner of her eye? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have walked away? She didn't know the answer. She only knew she didn't like being visible. On the 5th day, 2 unfamiliar men entered the armory. They wore plain clothes. No rank visible. No unit markings. Just posture and eyes that didn't miss anything. They didn't look at the weapons. They looked at her. That was when the weight dropped. They didn't introduce themselves immediately. They spoke quietly with the ranger captain. They watched her hands. They took notes. Ivy pretended not to notice. She always pretended not to notice. But this was different. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was evaluation. One of them asked to see her logs. She handed them over. Another asked how long she had been using her current alignment method. "Years," she said. "Where did you learn it?" "From experience." He didn't push. He wrote something down. They asked to see a rifle she had worked on months ago. Then another. Then another. She watched them compare small details. Padding placement. Mount symmetry. Torque distribution. No one had ever examined her work like that. Not for performance. For identification. That thought made her throat tighten. Later that afternoon, one of the soldiers whispered, "What's going on with her?" Another said, "No idea. But those aren't supply guys." Ivy kept her headphones in. She didn't turn around, but she could feel it. Her invisibility was cracking. When she left that evening, she took a different route back to her apartment. She checked reflections in windows. She hated herself for doing it. She hated that part of her still existed. The next morning, she found a note on her bench. Please report to conference room B at 1400. No signature, no explanation. Her chest tightened. For the rest of the morning, she worked slower than usual. She double-checked everything. She logged more than necessary. Her hands were still steady, but her thoughts were not. What would you do? She asked herself. Would you pretend this isn't happening? She finished her last task, cleaned her station, and left exactly on time. The hallway to conference room B felt longer than it should have. She paused outside the door, breathed, straightened her sleeves, then knocked. Inside were the ranger captain and the two plainclothesmen. A third chair waited. The door closed behind her. And for the first time, Ivy Calder understood that this wasn't about physics anymore. This wasn't about hypotheticals. This wasn't about curiosity. This was about her. And whatever she had accidentally touched was no longer theoretical. They didn't accuse her. That was what unsettled Ivy the most. The ranger captain introduced the two men as federal investigators, but he didn't say from where. They didn't ask if she had done anything wrong. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They just asked questions that felt too careful to be casual. When did she start using that scope alignment method? Where had she learned to counter-torque like that? Why did she always balance weight forward instead of rear? She answered simply. Years of habit. Trial and error. Personal preference. They nodded. Wrote things down. Then one of them slid a photo across the table. It was a rifle case, not the rifle itself. Just the case. Black. Scuffed. A tear near the handle. Something inside her tightened. She didn't know why. Have you seen this before? The man asked. She studied it. No, she said honestly. They waited. She almost said nothing else. Almost. There was a ranger, she added, eyes still on the photo. Months ago. He asked about wind drift at extreme extension. Not like people do when they're curious. Like he was preparing. The room changed. The captain leaned forward. What did he look like? She closed her eyes. Not for drama. For accuracy. He was quiet. Didn't waste words. Listened more than he spoke. She opened her eyes. He had a tattoo. A compass. Left forearm. Both investigators looked at each other. That was when Ivy realized her memory mattered. They asked her to describe him. She did. Broken nose that had healed wrong. Close-set eyes. Scar along his jawline. Not fresh. Old. He wasn't angry, she said. He was focused. That's different. How? The captain asked. Anger leaks, Ivy said. It shows in posture. In impatience. He didn't rush. He measured. She didn't know why she said that. She just knew it was true. The investigators asked her what he'd wanted. She hesitated. He asked about Coriolis compensation over long distances. About cold bore behavior at extreme extension. About vertical mirage distortion. The captain blinked. That's not casual curiosity. No, Ivy said. It wasn't. She didn't tell them that he had asked her what it felt like to miss. She didn't tell them that he had asked if she thought people deserved consequences. She didn't tell them that he had asked how far someone would have to be before distance stopped feeling real. They didn't need to know that. They asked about the rifle. She explained. The modifications. The way it had been balanced. The way the scope had been mounted. That's your work, one of the investigators said quietly. Lots of people do similar things, Ivy replied. But not exactly like this, he said. That word again. Exactly. Her hands curled slightly in her lap. They told her there was a missing ranger. Not dead, not confirmed alive. Missing. 7 months. Elite sniper. Disappeared after a mission went wrong. They didn't tell her the details yet. They just told her his name. Elias Ward. She felt it like pressure in her chest. Not recognition. Not memory. Just wait. They asked if she remembered anything else. She thought of the way he had waited for her to finish a sentence, the way he hadn't corrected her, the way he had asked if she believed a shot could be a message. I remember how he stood, she said. Always angled, like he was already planning exits. They asked if she'd noticed anything strange. She hesitated. He asked me what I thought about distance, she said. Not ballistically, psychologically. The room went quiet. What did you say? The captain asked. That distance doesn't make things smaller, Ivy replied. It makes them quieter. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. She hadn't said it in years. The investigators exchanged another look. They asked her if she would help them. Not hunt him. Not trap him. Not trap him. Understand him. She didn't answer right away. They didn't push. That night, Ivy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She kept seeing the compass tattoo, north. Not direction, orientation. She wondered what had happened to him. What kind of loss made someone plan a shot like that? She wondered why it felt familiar. The next morning, they brought in a military sketch artist. A corporal with careful hands. They asked her to describe him again. She watched as the face formed on the page. The broken nose. The eyes. The scar. When it was done, she knew, not because she recognized him, but because she recognized the stillness. That's him, she said. They turned the page toward her. Below the sketch was a name. Staff Sergeant Elias Ward. Status missing. Ivy felt the weight of it settle into her bones. This wasn't just about a shot. This was about someone who had decided distance was the only way left to speak, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, Ivy Calder understood exactly what that kind of silence felt like. The woman didn't look dangerous. That was the first thing Ivy noticed. She wore jeans, a green jacket, and scuffed boots. Her hair was pulled back into a loose knot. No military bearing, no tactical posture. She could have been a student, a courier, a tourist who had taken a wrong turn. She stood just inside the armory doorway, holding a thin manila envelope against her chest. I was told to find Ivy Calder, she said, her accent soft, Eastern European, careful. Several heads turned. Ivy felt it before she saw it, the shift, the tightening of the room. She didn't respond right away. The woman looked around, then back to Ivy. Her eyes were sharp, alert, too aware of exits. I was told you would understand, she added. That made Ivy stand. Slowly. About what? Ivy asked. The woman hesitated, then walked closer. Not threatening, not timid. Controlled. She set the envelope on Ivy's bench. Inside were papers, not notes. Not diagrams, models. Wind vectors mapped by altitude layers. Spindrift projections. Mirage distortion at extreme range. Terrain slope corrections. Microclimate interference zones. Ivy's breath caught before she could stop it. These were not hobbyist calculations. These were not academic exercises. These were operational. Someone behind Ivy whispered, "What the hell is that?" The woman washed Ivy's face, not the papers. He said you would know what was wrong, she said. Ivy swallowed. She scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. These Coriolis values are off, she said quietly. The woman exhaled. Ivy looked up. By 0.03 degrees. That error compounds at extension. The woman nodded once. Like she'd been waiting for that. Ivy flipped to the terrain map. This wasn't a range. This wasn't desert. This was mountainous, urban valley. European architecture. Long, clean lines of sight. Too clean. This elevation differential is underestimated, Ivy said. Thermal updrafts will bend the path unpredictably at this angle. The woman leaned in. Can it be corrected? Yes, Ivy said. But that's not the problem. What is? This shot isn't meant to be repeatable, Ivy said. The woman's jaw tightened. It's meant to be symbolic, Ivy continued. The room was quiet. One of the soldiers had stopped pretending not to listen. The woman said nothing. Ivy pointed to the distance. 4,000 meters. Merely. Not quite. Why this far? Ivy asked. The woman hesitated. Then answered. Because closer feels like murder, she said. Far enough feels like a statement. Ivy felt something cold bloom in her chest. She didn't know why those words landed so hard. But they did. She looked at the final page. Projected shot window. Time. Angle. Weather dependencies. And then she saw it, not the numbers. The intent. This isn't about probability, Ivy said. This is about defiance. The woman nodded slowly. He wants the distance to mean something, Ivy whispered. He wants it to feel impossible. Not because it is, but because people will argue about it instead of why. The woman stared at her. You've been listening, Ivy said. Always, the woman replied. Ivy exhaled. She felt eyes on her now. Not mockery, not dismissal. Something else. She corrected 2 more variables. Then another. She circled a section in red. This will fail, she said. Why? Because he's too angry, Ivy replied. The woman stiffened. Anger makes you rush, Ivy continued. It makes you compress time. It makes you want resolution, not precision. The woman's eyes narrowed. You don't know him. I know grief, Ivy said. The room felt heavier. The woman didn't argue. Why that distance? Ivy asked softly. Why not closer? The woman didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Ivy already knew. Because he doesn't want to hear the sound, Ivy said. He doesn't want to see the face. Silence. Ivy looked down at the papers again. He's not trying to escape, she added. He's trying to make it impossible for anyone to pretend this didn't happen. The woman whispered, Yes. Ivy closed the folder. Then, calmly, she pressed the panic button under her bench. The woman didn't notice. Not right away. Ivy met her eyes. You should leave, Ivy said. The woman shook her head. He needs your validation. He doesn't need a shot, Ivy said. He needs acknowledgement. That's not how systems work, the woman said. That's why people break them, Ivy replied. The woman's phone vibrated. She glanced down, then back up. Her eyes sharpened. They're coming, she said. Ivy didn't ask who. Smoke burst near the doorway. Shouts. Movement. The woman bolted. Ivy didn't chase. She stood still, heart pounding, listening to boots thunder past her. When it was over, the investigators surrounded her. They asked what the woman wanted. Ivy told them. They asked what the papers were. Ivy handed them over. They asked if she knew what the target was. She shook her head. But she knew something else. This isn't overseas, Ivy said. The captain looked at her sharply. What? This terrain, Ivy said, tapping the map. This isn't hostile territory. This is controlled. Public. Visible. The investigators went still. He wants witnesses, Ivy continued, not casualties. Who? The captain asked. Ivy didn't answer. She just pointed. To the direction. To the system. This isn't about enemies, she said. This is about betrayal. And for the first time, no one in the room doubted her. The colonel arrived without announcement. No knock. No escort. Just the soft click of the door and the shift in the room that followed. Ivy didn't look up at first. She was seated at the conference table, hands folded, listening as one of the investigators spoke in low tones. The ranger captain stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. The colonel stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't speak. He studied her. Not her face, her hands. The way they rested, relaxed but ready. The way her fingers curved slightly inward, as if they expected weight. Then he stepped forward. 1 foot. Then another. Slow. Measured. Everyone else fell silent without realizing why. The colonel leaned forward slightly. "What did you say your name was again?" he asked. "Ivy Calder," she replied. Something in his expression changed. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. He straightened. "Calder," he repeated quietly. The room seemed to shrink. He walked around the table, stopping behind her. "Do you still bias forward on the third axis when stabilizing long platforms?" he asked. Ivy froze, not visibly. "Internally, yes," she said. "Even though the manuals discourage it? Yes." The colonel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "I haven't seen anyone do that since Ghostline." No one spoke, no one moved. The word didn't mean anything to most of them, but the way he said it did. "That was a closed-range designation," the colonel continued. "Experimental. Disbanded quietly. No public record." He looked at Ivy's hands again. "You were the only one who could keep the optics honest past what the test ranges allowed," he said. "You corrected drift by feel before the data caught up." Ivy didn't respond. The room held its breath. "You went by a different name," he added. She swallowed. He didn't push. He didn't ask. He simply said it. "Calder wasn't your call sign." Silence. Not awkward. Not tense. Reverent. The ranger captain slowly uncrossed his arms. One of the investigators lowered his pen. The colonel stepped back, his voice still low. "You didn't miss," he said. "Not because you were perfect, but because you knew when not to shoot." That was when Ivy finally looked up. Not at him. At the floor. The room didn't need explanations. It didn't need records. It didn't need stories. The shift had already happened. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't underestimated. She wasn't a question. She was a fact. And no one in that room spoke for several long seconds. Because everyone felt it. The weight. The quiet. The truth settling into place. No one laughed anymore. The same soldiers who had once leaned against lockers with smirks now stood with their arms at their sides, unsure where to look. The contractors who had spoken over her now spoke less, their voices softer, careful. Even the investigators' men trained to command rooms waited before talking, as if sound itself might disturb something fragile. Ivy felt it before she saw it. Respect has a weight. It settles differently than fear. They had moved to a secure operations room overlooking a live feed. The tower in Germany sat still in the distance, framed by fog and low morning light. Somewhere inside, Staff Sergeant Elias Ward waited. The colonel nodded toward her. "She should speak," he said, "not should like instruction. Should like fact." Ivy stood slowly. Her hands were steady, her voice was not loud. "Elias," she said into the microphone. There was no response. She tried again. "You asked me once if distance makes things smaller." A breath. Then static. Then a voice, quiet but unmistakable. "No," Ward said. "It makes them quieter." Several people in the room stiffened. Ivy closed her eyes. "You chose that distance because you didn't want to hear it," she said. You didn't want to hear the sound. You didn't want to see the face. You wanted the act to be clean, not easy. Silence. "You don't want to be a killer," she continued. "You want to be a witness." The feed remained still. "I know why you did that," Ivy said. "Because if it's impossible, then no one can ignore it. If it's impossible, then people have to ask why. Ward's voice came back, tight. They buried him. Ivy swallowed. They buried his name, he said. They buried the truth. I know, she replied. You don't, he snapped. You weren't there. No, Ivy said, but I've been where you are. The room stilled. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. You're trying to force a system to feel, Ivy said, but systems don't feel. People do. I gave them chances, Ward said. I followed every procedure. And it killed him, Ivy replied. Her words were not sharp. They were heavy. You think distance makes this less real, she said, but it doesn't. It just gives you time to regret it. Several soldiers shifted. One of the investigators looked away. Elias, Ivy said, softer now. You don't want to win. You want it to stop hurting. His breathing came through the line. Slow. Controlled. But not calm. You chose me because you knew I wouldn't lie to you, she said. So I won't. She leaned closer to the microphone. If you take that shot, they will remember the distance, not the reason. The feed trembled slightly. If you don't, she continued, they will have to listen. No one spoke, not the colonel. Not the captain. Not the men who had once mocked her. All of them watched. And waited. Finally, Ward spoke. What if I surrender? He asked. Ivy didn't smile. She didn't exhale. She just answered. Then your grief becomes testimony instead of violence. Another pause. Longer. The feed shifted. A figure moved inside the tower. A rifle was set down. Slowly, deliberately. The sound of a weapon meeting concrete echoed faintly through the microphone. Several people in the room covered their mouths. Not in fear, in disbelief. Ward's voice returned, hollow and calm. I'm coming out. No one moved. No one spoke. Not until Ivy sat back down. Not because she was told to, but because the moment had ended. And the room, for the first time, felt like it could breathe again. The aftermath did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, in reports and hearings, in sealed rooms where voices were low and faces were tired. Staff Sergeant Elias Ward was taken into custody without resistance. There were no cameras, no spectacle. Just a man walking out of a tower with his hands visible, eyes forward, carrying the weight of what he had almost done and what he had chosen not to. The court proceedings followed. They were long, careful, heavy with language meant to contain things that did not want to be contained. Desertion, unauthorized operations, endangerment, but also testimony. Ward spoke. Not to defend himself, not to justify, but to explain. He spoke about his teammate, about the mission, about the silence that followed, about what it feels like when truth is buried under procedure. Ivy did not attend every session. She did not need to. She read the transcripts alone at night, headphones in, the same way she always had. Some consequences could not be avoided. Ward lost his rank. His future changed, but the investigation did not stop with him. It widened. Reports were reopened. Decisions were questioned. Names that had been protected were suddenly spoken out loud. Accountability, slow and imperfect, began to move. Ivy returned to the armory. Same bench, same tools, same quiet hum. But something had changed. People greeted her now, not loudly. Not awkwardly, just with awareness. They didn't ask questions. They didn't pry. They simply made space. She still ate alone when she wanted to. Still worked late. Still wore her headphones. But now, invisibility was no longer her armor. It was her choice. One afternoon, the ranger captain stopped by her bench. You didn't have to do that, he said. She knew what he meant. I wanted to, Ivy replied. He nodded. That was enough. Weeks later, she stood near the edge of the base at sunset, watching light stretch across the tarmac. She thought about distance, about silence, about how easy it was to confuse control with healing. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Some people seek justice by burning everything down. Others seek it by telling the truth out loud. One destroys. The other changes. Justice and revenge are not the same thing. And sometimes the bravest shot a person can make is the one they choose not to take. Some heroes never stand on podiums. They don't wear their stories on their sleeves. They don't ask to be remembered. They move quietly through the world, carrying more than anyone ever sees, choosing restraint when they could choose anger, choosing truth when it would be easier to disappear. War doesn't only take lives. It takes futures, friendships, and pieces of people that never come back the same. Grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like distance. And sometimes it looks like someone choosing not to pull a trigger when the world expects them to. Ivy Calder never asked to be known. She only chose to be honest. And sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more FOB veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.